Special welcome to those who are joining us online. It's great to have you. Let's begin our meditation together in prayer. Would you join me? Lord, set us apart by the truth. Your word is truth. Amen. Founding father, inventor, philosopher Benjamin Franklin is quoted as saying, "In the world, nothing is certain but death and taxes." For some of you, the looming April 15th might feel like a death date, and you associate those pretty closely. But death is all around us, isn't it? The statistics are kind of staggering. Around the globe, every second, 1.78 people die. I know you can't have 1.78, so let's put it in context. Just that video before the sermon, about 60 seconds, over 100 people died around the world during that one video. If you live to a ripe old age of 70, which isn't even all that ripe and old, between your birth and your death, 3.9 billion people will have died. That's a lot of death. And it feels even more imminent when someone close to us, someone we know, a friend, a colleague, a relative, part of our family, dies. Death isn't just a statistic, it's a lived experience. Why? Why is there so much death going on around the world all the time? It's a good question. And if you've been around at all for this series in the beginning, you know where we're going to turn as we look for answers. If you haven't been, if you've missed one or all of the sermons, go back on our YouTube channel. It's worth taking the time to watch those, to dig into and explore some of the biggest questions. This one is one of them. We're heading back to the beginning, specifically to Genesis 5 and Genesis 6. So if you've got a Bible or Bible app open you'd like to follow along, that's where we're turning. First, Genesis 5. And we're going to find out that by this point in Genesis, death is nothing new. God had attached the curse of death to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We've watched animals die. We watched Cain kill his brother. But it's hard to escape that in Genesis 5, the tone shifts. There's a different feeling about death. It's not just something that happens to some people sometimes. It happens to everyone, every time. And if Genesis 5 is a change of tone, Genesis 6 is going to be that tone turned up to 11. But don't let me just tell you about it. Let's read it. Genesis chapter 5. I'm going to read verses 1. We'll read just a small section of this. You're going to get a sense of how this whole chapter goes from this short section. Take a look. Verse 1. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them. And he named them mankind when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image. Notice that the image of God has already been lost. And he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. After he became the father of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years, and then he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he became the father of Kenan. After he became the father of Kenan, Enosh lived 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enosh lived a total of 905 years, and then he died. This chapter goes on for another 19 verses, and this refrain plays out over and over and over again. There's this pattern, this rhythm. So-and-so was born, they lived a number of years, they had a child, they lived another set of years, they had other children, and then they died. And they died. And they died. And they died. It feels a lot like, as you read through Genesis 5, it feels a lot like the tolling of a bell. announcing the death of yet another generation, the curse of sin reaching its culmination in the end of life itself. Generation after generation after generation. Is that fair? The frequency, the totality of death for these early people, it seems out of proportion. That Adam and Eve would take a bite of a fruit and they and everyone after them would die as a result of it. It's hard not to lay each of these deaths at the feet of God and ask for his reasoning. I mean, if God hadn't created that tree in the first place, if he hadn't attached a curse to that tree, if he hadn't held Adam and Eve accountable to that curse, if he hadn't cursed not just Adam and Eve, but their children and grandchildren, every generation after them, death would not drip off the pages of this history the way it does. How is this fair? The gap between the offense and the punishment seems incredibly disproportionate. And it leaves us looking for answers. Leaves us in a position feeling like we're painted in a corner trying to justify why that gap exists. And if you feel like the gap is big in Genesis 5, hold on tight because Genesis 6 is going to turn that up even more. Take a look. We'll start at verse 5. Again, I'll just read a section. You're going to catch on quickly to what's going on here. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, and for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is the word of our God. While Genesis 5 feels like the natural rhythms of life and death, even if they are extremely long rhythms, there's nothing natural about chapter 6. This goes even beyond natural disaster. This is an act of God. The summary execution of every man, woman, and child. How could God? Why would God send a flood? And it's not as though this is an isolated incident. Page through the history of the Old Testament, and you will find plenty of examples. Plenty of fodder for the religiously skeptical to lob accusations at God. So how do we answer? That's where going back to the beginning is so helpful. Because if we don't start from the same place, it's almost impossible for us to end up going to the same destination. And what do we find out from the beginning? 1, that everything is God's. He created. Everything we see, everything we measure, everything that we surmise is there, everything that we have yet to discover, every life is God's. He created it. He sustains it. He provides for it, protects it, watches over it. All life is His. Imagine a Lego brick master creating some sort of phenomenal design, phenomenal Lego piece. Would he need your approval to do something with that Lego masterpiece? Would he need your signature if he wanted to move it or change it or even destroy it? Is that the role you get to play? Or as brickmaster, as the designer, the creator, does he get to do whatever he wants with that Lego? The second thing we learn is God is not only creator, but he is designer. Everything he created for a purpose, to play a role. In other words, he wrote the owner's manual. He wrote the purpose for which humanity on the whole, and why each human exists. Isn't it reasonable to give him the latitude that if a part of his creation started to stray from its specifications, doesn't he have the right to bring it back in line with the purpose for which he made it? But maybe your objection isn't that God intervened. I mean, it does sound pretty bad, doesn't it? Did you catch that description in chapter 6, verse 5? We read this: every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. That sounds like a terrible world to live in. So maybe you don't object to the fact that God intervened. It's the bigness, the grandness of the intervention that's a problem. That it would be a worldwide catastrophic flood that would claim the lives of all but 8. And if so, if that's your objection, can I suggest that maybe you don't see sin and evil the way God does? I mean, we look at this story, had a worldwide flood, and we think all of this death, all of this work, all this totality, just for some evil in the world? But in God's vocabulary, just and evil don't coexist. Those aren't words that end up in the same sentence. Because in God's vocabulary, evil is the thing that destroys his creation in the first place. It's not a flood that destroys it, it's the evil. And that is borne out in our own experience. The worst things we can imagine, the worst experiences of the human race, things like racism and bigotry, anxiety, depression, murder, war, genocide, famine, and drought, these all trace their roots back to sin. They would not exist if sin were not in this world. And that's just human to human sin. The consequences of human to God sin? No, we don't see evil the way God sees it too often. But neither do we see death the way God sees it. And maybe that's not surprising. Humans have been trying to run from death for their entire existence. We try to hide from it. We try to conquer it. We try to overpower it. We overpower it when our life pursuit is to accumulate enough wealth, enough influence, enough accolades, to have a large enough impact that even after we're gone, our legacy still lives on. We're trying to overcome death. We try to conquer it. Right now, there are several projects being carried out in Silicon Valley that if the inventors and engineers had their way, you'd be able to upload your brain to a computer. I know it sounds like science fiction, but this is actual science research happening right now. A digital fountain of life. We try to hide from death. Make our cars safer. Constant vigilance over our kids, print warning labels on cigarettes, all because we don't see death the way that God sees it. We don't see that God has turned this curse into a blessing, that he can bend even death to his will to accomplish his good purposes. If you want to see death the way that God sees it, you need to adopt a biblical worldview. We get a couple of hints of what that looks like. When Paul writes in Philippians chapter 1, he says this: "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." 1,500 years before that, Moses had put it this way, very similar thought: "Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom." See, Jesus' followers don't chase after death like we belong to some ancient code of the samurai. But neither do we run from it in fear. We see that even death is a tool in the hands of God, a tool of rescue. That's what we see in the story of Noah. Can you imagine living in that world? Where you and 7 others are the only ones. Everyone else stands against you. I wonder how many nights Noah and his wife lay awake at night in desperate prayer that their sons would come home. How many anxious conversations did they have? Praying that those sons would not trade away their love for Jesus, love for the Lord, for love for someone or something else. Imagine living that way, not just for a couple of weeks or years, not just for teenage years, but decade after decade, for more than a century. God rescued Noah, rescued his family. And that's the heart of this story. God hates death. Not even as much as any of us. He hates it more than any one person does. It was never part of his design. That's not how he created this world. But just because he didn't create it doesn't mean he can't use it. And he uses it in tremendous ways, where the death, back in Noah's day, he used death to save a few in the family of Noah. It would be his death who would save many. Paul gives us that insight in Romans chapter 5 when he says, "Consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people. For just as through the disobedience of the one man the many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of the one man, even obedience to death, the many will be made righteous." Don't you see? Jesus turned in his life. He walked the path of death as if he were walking your path. He walked through that door, and then he walked right back out to prove that death holds no fear for you. And with the fear of death gone, the power of death is broken. You are no longer under the power of death. You are free to live your life unafraid of death. And that has real world, everyday applications. Are you anxious? God looks at you and smiles and calls you enough. Are you filled with shame? God meets you with unending and unconditional love. Racked with guilt, Jesus has swept all that away. You find yourself hating someone. You don't need to be the one that exacts vengeance. God will see justice done, and he doesn't miss a thing. Do you numb with video games, alcohol, or pornography? Jesus enters into that hurt, and he doesn't numb it, he heals it. When we see death the way God sees it, it stops being a boogeyman that lurks around every corner. It becomes instead a doorway, a benign doorway that each of us walks through. I've been blessed to sit at more than a few deathbeds. And for all the emotions that go on there among the family, among the person lying there, there's a beautiful moment. And it usually happens a couple of days, maybe a couple of hours before the end, when the person who's facing death releases their anxiety and says simply in trust, "I'm ready. Jesus, come and take me home." one last rescue. Death may be everywhere. But the story of Noah leads me to investigate a Jesus who takes death out of the category of taxes and into the category of brushing your teeth, not something you need to avoid. And in Jesus, nothing to be afraid of. Amen.
It was great to have you join us at St. Mark today. We'd like to help you. If you would like more information about next steps, maybe for partnership at St. Mark, or ways you can serve or be involved in a Bible class or a small group, or be involved in children's ministry, or maybe you have a prayer request for us, go ahead and use our website. We'd be more than happy to help you take that next step in your journey with Jesus, or even maybe start one. And as you now go out into your mission field, what I'd like to do is bless you. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord look on you with favor and give you his peace. Amen. Remember, you matter and you are loved.